the mother and her son suddenly saw a large number of fighter jets speeding through the sky. Just as they were stunned by the sight before them, a bomb suddenly exploded beside them. Panicked, Antonina immediately shielded her son and ran back to their room. She never expected that the war her husband had been worrying about had actually begun. While calming her son's flustered emotions, she quickly packed their luggage to flee. The moment Antonina stepped out of the room, she found the zoo she and her husband had painstakingly managed for years was now in a state of chaos. Watching the animals running around, Antonina, who had always been dedicated to her duties, could only let them flee freely, because at that moment, her most important task was to take her son away from this city about to be devastated by war. Before they could run out of the zoo, they saw a group of soldiers shooting and hunting animals everywhere to prevent them from attacking the crowd. Helpless, Antonina ran while begging the soldiers to show mercy, for these animals were not only her property but also friends she had raised and protected for years. Previously, the happiest thing for her every day was waking up to see her husband busy around the animals. She would ride her bicycle throughout the entire zoo every day, personally saying good morning to each animal. But now that war had broken out, no matter how much she pleaded, the soldiers following orders remained indifferent, continuing to shoot at the running animals. Although filled with reluctance, Antonina was powerless at that moment. She could only rush into the train station with her son, which was already crowded with dazed and helpless people. All of them were looking up helplessly at the German fighter jets speeding past one after another overhead. Antonina never expected that after struggling so hard to reach the station, she would hear the station broadcast announce that all trains were suspended due to an emergency. Not knowing where to go, Antonina could only wander aimlessly in the station with her son. After much thought, she finally took her son back to their home, back to the now broken-down zoo. Looking at the scene before her, Antonina was filled with sadness. Her husband kept comforting her, believing that as long as their family of 3 was safe, all difficulties could be overcome. With the help of others, they gradually recovered a small number of animals that had run out of the zoo. But since the zoo was now in ruins and the war had broken out, Antonina and her husband were forced to close it. Soon, the German army fully occupied the city, and the zoo where Antonina's family lived became a temporary military camp for the Germans. What shocked Antonina more was that a few days later, a German representative suddenly found her, saying that all the precious animals in the zoo had to be inventoried and transported back to Germany. Although Antonina was heartbroken, with the entire city occupied by the Germans, she had no choice but to send the animals she had raised for years onto the truck. From then on, only some common animals remained in Antonina and her husband's zoo, but she never imagined that half a month later, the Germans suddenly began shooting and slaughtering all the animals in the zoo. Their reason for the massacre was that the zoo no longer existed in name, and it was better to let the remaining animals become fragrant food, serving their last purpose for German soldiers. Listening to the continuous gunshots outside, the helpless Antonina and her son could only hold each other tightly and cry. In such a turbulent era, living a peaceful life had truly become an unattainable luxury. This was a painful experience that Jews could never forget. Not only were the wealth they had worked hard for a lifetime confiscated by the Germans, but they were also driven into a crowded and narrow ghetto like a prison. It was not only cramped and narrow but also lacked living supplies, with the bodies of Jews who had frozen or starved to death lying everywhere in the streets. At first glance, it was like a human purgatory full of hunger, disease, and death. Antonina looked at her friend on the verge of entering the ghetto and fell into deep thought. This was her best friend since childhood, so she wanted to hide her in their home until the war ended. But her husband hesitated, fearing that if discovered by the Germans, it would bring disaster to their family. However, Antonina refused to watch her friend enter the hellish ghetto. Finally, after Antonina's earnest pleading, her husband agreed to her idea. Thus, Antonina hid her best friend in the storage room of their home. As the narrow ghetto gradually became overcrowded, the Germans began transferring Jews from the ghetto to concentration camps in batches. When Antonina's friend learned about the situation outside, she couldn't bear to see her fellow Jews suffer and begged Antonina to save as many Jews as possible. Antonina, naturally kind-hearted, finally agreed to do her best under her friend's pleading. To avoid suspicion, Antonina decided to reopen the abandoned zoo. So she and her husband Jan went to the German officer, hoping he would transfer the German soldiers stationed in the zoo to other places. They said they wanted to convert the zoo into a pig farm to provide cheap pork for the German army. They also said that to minimize the cost of pork, They wanted to enter the ghetto every day to collect food scraps as feed for the pigs. Hearing that the couple was thinking so much for the German army, the officer happily agreed to their request. Just like that, the zoo Antonina had managed for years was transformed into a huge pig farm. Although the German soldiers previously stationed in the zoo had left, the officer still left 20 German soldiers to patrol and guard the zoo. In the following days, Antonina's husband Jan entered the ghetto every day as planned to collect food scraps. Their plan was to use the truck to enter and exit the ghetto daily, then find opportunities to hide Jews from the ghetto and the food scraps and secretly transport them to the zoo-turned-pig farm. Then they would hide the smuggled Jews in their home, providing shelter until the war ended. But many things are easier said than done. Jan had been entering and exiting the ghetto for more than half a month, yet he hadn't saved a single person, because he was always afraid that rescuing Jews would be discovered by the Germans. He hadn't started the rescue operation. Despite Antonina's repeated encouragement, he remained hesitant and made no progress, until one day, when he again entered the ghetto, he accidentally saw a 16 or 17-year-old girl being forcefully dragged into an alley by 2 German soldiers. Just then, the Jewish girl was suddenly blocked by 2 German soldiers, and the next second, the lustful soldiers began molesting her. Sensing danger, she immediately tried to leave, but her struggles were insignificant against the strong and armed Germans. All of this was seen by Jan, who had just entered the ghetto. Watching the girl being pushed reluctantly into the alley by the 2 soldiers, the sharp-eyed Jan had already guessed the tragic experience the girl was about to face. But even so, though Jan was filled with grief and indignation, he could only silently watch the tragedy unfold before him. Then Jan drove the truck to collect food scraps in the ghetto as usual. When he finished loading the food scraps and was about to leave, he saw the girl again. By then, the girl had been tortured beyond recognition by the Germans. Looking at her miserable appearance, Jan could no longer suppress his inner grief and indignation. After a few seconds of hesitation, he angrily jumped out of the truck, determined to risk taking the girl away from the hellish ghetto. He directly hid the girl in the passenger seat, then took off his coat to cover her, and immediately asked his son to sit in the passenger seat to hide her. Without any pause, Jan started the truck and quickly approached the ghetto gate. Although he had entered and exited the ghetto many times before, the cautious Germans conducted a thorough inspection of his truck as always. Though the inspection took less than a minute in total, Jan, whose heart was already in a state of panic, felt that every second was as long and tormenting as a century. Fortunately, the girl hidden in the passenger seat was not discovered by the Germans. In this way, Jan successfully rescued the first Jew from the ghetto. When his wife Antonina saw the girl crouching like a frightened fawn in the truck, motionless, a complex mix of joy and grief instantly filled her heart. She was overjoyed that her husband had finally succeeded in rescuing a Jew from the German-set ghetto. She was grieved that the poor girl, not yet an adult, had suffered such a painful and unforgettable experience. The kind-hearted Antonina tried every means to soothe the girl's emotions. Under her constant persuasion, the girl finally showed a pitiful smile. Looking at the girl with a tragic fate before her, Antonina became more determined to continue rescuing Jews. In the days that followed, her husband Jan began seizing every opportunity to save as many Jews as possible. After days of hard work, the couple had hidden more than a dozen Jews in their home. Since her husband was busy outside all day, the task of taking care of these Jews fell to Antonina. But Antonina encountered a very tricky problem. She and her husband had converted the zoo they had managed for years into a pig farm to raise pork for the German army. The German officer who had long coveted Antonina's beauty recently began frequenting her home under the pretense of inspecting the pig farm. Each time, he found every excuse to linger in Antonina's home, reluctant to leave. If the Jews hidden in the basement made even the slightest sound, the consequences would be unthinkable. But powerless, Antonina could only force a smile and feign agreement with the German officer before her. Until one day, when Antonina had finally managed to see the officer to the door, he suddenly approached her with ill intent. Antonina's heart instantly panicked, unsure how to respond. Just then, the Jewish boy hidden in the basement woke from a nightmare and burst into loud sobs. In a desperate moment, Antonina covered the officer's ears with both hands. This action ignited the long-suppressed desire in the officer's heart. He immediately began kissing Antonina unashamedly. Thankfully, Antonina's husband returned home in the nick of time, and the officer left reluctantly. In the days that followed, the German officer sought out Antonina whenever he was free. Antonina tried every means to avoid being alone with him in the room. She always found excuses to stay outside, hoping to protect herself. But even so, the officer began to make advances toward her. This scene was seen clearly by her husband upon his return. Misunderstanding the situation, He thought his wife had betrayed him for the first time in their marriage. He spoke angry, confusing words to Antonina. He even slammed the door shut before she could enter. At dinner, he remained silent, and even late into the night, he stood on the balcony smoking furiously, noticing her husband's odd behavior. Antonina hurried to ask what was wrong. He finally revealed what he had seen that evening. Upon hearing this, Antonina was completely flustered. She tried to explain, but her husband, consumed by anger, flung her hands away and marched into the room in silence. Antonina stood there desperate and helpless, filled with grief and powerlessness. The next evening, when her husband returned, he saw Antonina with the German officer again. His heart completely broke that moment. That night, he proposed divorce to Antonina. Overwhelmed with grief, Antonina finally told him the entire story. Understanding her plight, Jan was overcome with self-blame. He hated himself for failing to protect his beloved wife. Powerless, he could only comfort her. No matter what he does to you, you will always be my wife, the woman I love most. After days of thought, Jan resolved to join the rebel army fighting against the Germans. He wanted to take up arms to protect his wife. They launched attacks on German forces everywhere, waging a difficult guerrilla war. But one day, the rebels were suddenly surrounded by a large German force. Jan was shot in the battle and captured. Learning of her husband's capture, Antonina felt her world collapse. The only hope for rescuing him was the German officer who had long coveted her. She dressed carefully and reluctantly knocked on the officer's door. The man, already obsessed with her beauty, immediately removed her coat. Then layer by layer, piece by piece, stripped her of her clothes. Though Antonina was deeply unwilling, she did not resist. She was sacrificing herself to save her husband, whose life was unknown in German custody. The officer was her only hope. To her dismay, after taking her body, the officer did not help rescue her husband. Instead, he repeatedly deceived her into satisfying his desires. Antonina endured in silence, filled with grief. Time dragged on painfully, second by second, day by day, until one day, as German forces retreated rapidly on the front lines, the occupying soldiers in the city began packing to evacuate urgently. The German officer, ordered to retreat, came to Antonina's home to say goodbye but found her out. Only her son was home, having hidden a dozen Jews. The boy was alarmed by the officer's sudden arrival and grew vigilant. A 12-year-old child could not outwit a sharp-eyed German officer. Though he tried to answer questions, he slipped up. The officer instantly realized the house held a secret. He left quietly, but not before pinning an inner lapel badge on the boy's shirt, as if thanking him for the information that would advance his career. Their entire conversation was heard by a woman hidden in the next room, Antonina's friend, the first Jew she had hidden. Shortly after the officer left, Antonina returned. Her friend recounted every word of the boy's conversation with the officer. Guilt-ridden, the boy hid in Antonina's arms, but there was no time for sorrow. To prevent disaster, Antonina immediately arranged a truck to send all Jews away. She knew the home was no longer safe. Just as the truck started, it passed the German officer and his soldiers at the iron gate. Antonina hastily hid her son, taking deep breaths to calm her racing heart. The officer pushed past her without a word, leading soldiers to search the house thoroughly. When he saw drawings left by Jews on the basement wall, he understood everything. To make Antonina reveal where the Jews had gone, the officer raised his gun, threatening her son's life. Antonina begged him to spare her child, but the officer dragged the boy around the corner. A heart-wrenching gunshot rang out. In that moment, Antonina's world shattered. Thankfully, the officer had fired into the air. With the Soviet army approaching, brutal war was about to engulf the city. To escape, Antonina took her son and joined the fleeing crowd, leaving the city they had lived in for years. Only after the war ended did she return to the zoo, to their former home, with her son. It was now a ruin, but several Jews she had helped also returned. Together, they gradually breathed new life into the place. One morning a year later, Antonina saw a familiar figure approaching in the distance. It was her husband Jan, the one she had longed for day and night. After all their sufferings, the loving couple finally reunited. I'm a movie enthusiast. Please subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you next time.